What happens when love collides with power, wealth, and deep-seated prejudice? Ethan Carter, a self-made man, is ready to marry the love of his life, Isabel Montgomery. But her powerful father, Walter, sees him, and especially his working-class father, David, as unworthy. Just when they think the night will end in humiliation, David reveals a secret that shatters everything. What was his shocking gift, and how did it change everything? Where are you watching from? Subscribe now for more incredible stories. Ethan Carter adjusted his tie with steady fingers, but deep down, his heart pounded like a drum in his chest. The morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his hotel suite, casting long golden streaks across the plush carpet. Today was supposed to be the happiest day of his life. He was about to marry the woman he loved, the woman who had stood by him despite the many barriers that had threatened to pull them apart. But today wasn't just about love. It was about survival. He exhaled slowly, his reflection staring back at him from the mirror. Strong jaw, determined brown eyes, neatly trimmed beard. He looked the part of a groom ready to step into the next chapter of his life. But beneath that polished exterior lay a man who had fought tooth and nail for everything he had. A man who knew what it felt like to be looked down upon. A knock at the door snapped him out of his thoughts. His best man, Jordan, stepped in, already dressed in his tailored tuxedo. "Damn, you clean up nice," he said with a grin. But his eyes held a hint of concern. Ethan smirked. "Gotta look the part." Jordan folded his arms. "How you feeling?" Ethan shrugged, knowing that a simple, "I'm fine," wouldn't fool his oldest friend. Jordan didn't push. Instead, he leaned against the dresser. "They're gonna be watching you. You know that, right? Her family, their rich-ass friends. They're waiting for you to mess up." Ethan let out a low chuckle. "They've been waiting for that since the day I met Isabel." Jordan sighed. "Look, man, I know you love her, and I know she loves you, but her father, Walter Montgomery, is a shark in a tuxie. He's not just rich, he's powerful, the kind of man who doesn't lose." Ethan clenched his jaw. He knew exactly what kind of man Walter Montgomery was. A ruthless businessman who built an empire on Wall Street. A man who believed success was measured in wealth. A man who saw his daughter's marriage as a business transaction. To him, Ethan was an acquisition gone wrong. "I don't care what he thinks," Ethan finally said, adjusting his cufflinks. "I'm marrying Isabel, not her father." Jordan exhaled, shaking his head. "I just don't want you walking into this blind." Ethan gave him a small, reassuring smile. "I never walk into anything blind." Meanwhile, across the sprawling Montgomery estate, Isabel sat in her dressing room, staring at her reflection in the vanity mirror. The room was elegant, lined with ivory and gold, the kind of place fit for a princess. But she didn't feel like a princess. She felt like a woman on the verge of war. Her mother, Vivian Montgomery, stood behind her, adjusting the delicate lace veil that cascaded over her daughter's shoulders. "You look stunning," she said, her voice smooth, practiced. Isabel forced a smile. "Thanks, Mom." Vivian met her daughter's eyes in the mirror, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows lifting slightly. "You're nervous." It wasn't a question. Isabel sighed. "I just want everything to go smoothly." Vivian smirked. "Oh, darling, it will. You will walk down that aisle, say your vows, and soon enough, all of this will be behind you. All of this." Isabel knew exactly what her mother meant. The tension, the whispers, the blatant disapproval. Her family had never accepted Ethan. Not because he wasn't successful, he had built his own tech consulting firm from the ground up, but because of where he came from. He didn't come from old money, didn't have an Ivy League name attached to him, didn't grow up attending private galas. And worst of all, his father was a working-class man. Vivian pressed a hand to her daughter's shoulder. "You still have time, you know." Isabel turned to face her. "Time for what?" Vivian's lips curled into a knowing smile. "To reconsider." A flash of anger ignited in Isabel's chest. "I love Ethan." Vivian's expression didn't change. "And I believe you do. But love, my dear, isn't always enough." Isabel stood, pulling the veil from her head. "You're unbelievable." Vivian didn't flinch. "I just want what's best for you. And you think that's someone from your world, right? A man with a trust fund instead of a backbone?" Vivian sighed dramatically, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from her silk dress. "It's not about money, Isabel. It's about stability, a certain standard. Ethan is successful, yes, but his father isn't." There it was, the real reason. Isabel narrowed her eyes. "So, because David Carter is a mechanic, that makes Ethan unworthy?" Vivian gave a delicate shrug. "People talk, darling, and your father has built a legacy that we cannot afford to tarnish." Isabel shook her head in disbelief. "You and Dad always talk about legacy as if it's something you buy. But legacy is built on integrity, not money." Vivian smiled faintly. "That's a lovely thought, dear. But in our world, perception is everything." Isabel felt her stomach churn. She had known this would be difficult, but hearing her mother speak so plainly about her prejudices made her skin crawl. Before she could respond, a knock at the door interrupted them. A wedding planner peeked in. "Miss Montgomery, we're ready for the first round of photos." Vivian turned to her daughter, smoothing her veil back into place with a gentle touch. "Come now, darling. A smile, please. This is your wedding day, after all." Isabel forced another smile, but inside, a storm was brewing. Outside, the guests began to arrive. The Montgomery estate was the kind of place that belonged in magazines. Grand fountains, towering marble pillars, acres of manicured gardens. Valets in crisp black suits escorted luxury cars into a long, glittering row. Inside, servers weaved between guests, offering champagne on silver trays. David Carter stepped out of his modest sedan, adjusting the cuffs of his well-pressed but simple suit. He knew, without a doubt, that he was out of place here, but he wouldn't let that shake him. He wasn't here for these people. He was here for his son. As he made his way up the grand steps, he felt the stares, the subtle glances, the whispers. "Is that the groom's father? God, I heard he's a mechanic. Can you imagine? What could he possibly have gotten them as a wedding gift? A set of wrenches?" David's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. He had spent a lifetime enduring these kinds of looks, these kinds of murmurs. At the entrance, he was met by Walter Montgomery himself. The older man was an imposing figure, his tailored suit fitting him like armor. He extended a hand, a tight smile on his face. David shook it firmly. Walter glanced him up and down. "Quite the venue, isn't it? I imagine it's a little different from what you're used to." David smiled, unbothered. "A building's just a building, Walter. What matters is the people inside it." Walter chuckled, a cold sound. "And yet, some people belong in places like this, and others—" He let the words hang in the air, the insult clear. David met his gaze without flinching. That's the funny thing about belonging. It's not always about where you start. It's about where you choose to stand. Walter's smirk faded slightly. Before either man could say another word, Ethan appeared, stepping between them. "Dad," he said, his voice firm but warm. David gave him a reassuring nod. "You ready, son?" Ethan glanced at Walter, then back at his father. "I've never been more ready." David smiled. "Then let's do this." And as they walked through the grand doors, the weight of judgment and expectation followed them inside. But neither of them looked back. The grand hall of the Montgomery estate buzzed with quiet conversations as impeccably dressed guests glided through the candle-lit space. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over polished marble floors, the light reflecting off the fine glassware and shimmering designer gowns. Waiters in black tuxedos maneuvered gracefully between the clusters of people, balancing silver trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. It was a scene of luxury, of exclusivity, a world built for the elite. David Carter knew he didn't belong here. Standing near the entrance, he observed the room with the quiet patience of a man who had spent a lifetime being out of place. His well-pressed but simple suit was a stark contrast to the sea of custom-tailored tuxedos. And while the guests carried an air of effortless wealth, he carried the weight of hard work and the calluses on his hands. The subtle glances, the polite but dismissive nods. He had expected them. Ethan was across the room, engaged in a stiff conversation with one of Isabel's uncles, his posture tense but composed. He caught his father's eye for a brief second, and David gave him a reassuring nod. His son had inherited his resilience, but David knew tonight would test him in ways he hadn't yet imagined. He barely had time to take a sip of the champagne a waiter had pressed into his hand before a cold, familiar voice reached his ears. "Well, well, Mr. Carter, you actually came." David turned slowly to find Walter Montgomery standing beside him, his expression a picture of practiced politeness. Beside him, Vivian Montgomery gave David a slow, assessing glance, as if deciding whether acknowledging him was worth her time. David nodded once. "Of course. Wouldn't miss my son's wedding." Walter's lips curved into something resembling a smile. "And yet, I'm sure you can understand why some might find it surprising." David tilted his head. "Surprising? No, I don't think so. A father attending his son's wedding seems fairly standard." Walter chuckled, taking a slow sip of his whiskey. "Perhaps. But this isn't exactly your kind of event, is it?" David met his gaze without hesitation. "No, it's not. But I'm not here for the event. I'm here for Ethan." Vivian sighed dramatically, her diamond bracelet catching the light as she lifted a perfectly manicured hand to her chest. "You must understand, David, this isn't personal. We simply have concern." David raised an eyebrow. "Von Concerns?" Walter swirled his drink. "Ethan is a talented young man, smart, driven. He has potential, but marriage, well, marriage is a business partnership as much as it is a romantic one." David's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "That's an interesting way of looking at it." Vivian smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Ethan may have built himself up, but let's be honest, David, he doesn't come from the right background. And backgrounds matter." David studied her for a long moment. He had met people like the Montgomerys before, people who measured a person's worth by their bank account, their last name, their lineage. It was a mindset he had fought against his entire life, but standing here, in the heart of their world, he realized just how deeply their prejudices ran. "I see," he said finally. "And what exactly is the right background?" Walter sighed as if explaining something to a child. "Legacy, David. Status. Stability. A certain level of refinement." David chuckled softly. "And you don't think I provide that?" Vivian's eyes flicked over his suit. "Let's be honest, David. Your line of work is honorable, but it's not exactly fitting for our world." "Our world," David repeated, his voice even. "So that's what this is about. You think I lower the standard?" Walter didn't bother denying it. "I think you're a good man, David. I do. But good men aren't always the best fit for certain circles." David smiled slightly, but there was no warmth in it. "Well, Walter, I have no interest in your circles." Walter chuckled. "No, I didn't think you did." Before David could respond, a shrill laugh cut through the air. He turned just in time to see a group of elegantly dressed women whispering behind their champagne flutes, their gazes flickering toward him before turning back to their conversation with amused smirks. It wasn't hard to guess what they were whispering about. David turned back to Walter. "Tell me something. If Ethan didn't come from my background, if I were a CEO or a senator or an old money heir, would you still have concerns?" Walter's expression remained unreadable. "Ethan is a great match for Isabel. He's successful, hard-working, but perception is everything, David. And perception is shaped by lineage." David's grip tightened around his glass, but before he could respond, a voice cut through the tension. "I think the only perception that should matter is how Ethan treats me." The three of them turned to see Isabel stepping up beside David, her posture poised, but her eyes blazing. Her mother stiffened, but Isabel didn't so much as glance at her. Vivian recovered quickly. "Darling, we were just—" "I know exactly what you were doing, Mother." Isabel's voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. She turned to Walter. "And you, Dad?" Walter sighed. "Isabel, sweetheart, we're just looking out for you. We want what's best. Do you?" Isabel crossed her arms. "Because it doesn't feel like that. It feels like you're trying to manipulate the situation to fit your own expectations." Walter's expression tightened. "You misunderstand." "No," she interrupted. "I understand perfectly. And let me make something clear. This is my wedding, my marriage, and I will not stand here and let you disrespect the man who raised the person you claim to love." David felt a quiet swell of pride at Isabel's words. She turned back to him, offering a warm smile. "David, would you do me the honor of escorting me inside?" David hesitated for only a moment before nodding. He offered his arm, and she took it without hesitation. Together they stepped away, leaving Walter and Vivian standing in stunned silence. As they entered the ballroom, the whispers followed them, but Isabel didn't seem to care, and, for the first time that evening, neither did David. Ethan was waiting at the far end of the room, watching the exchange with careful eyes. When he saw Isabel standing proudly beside his father, his shoulders relaxed slightly. He stepped toward them, sliding an arm around Isabel's waist. "You okay?" he asked her quietly. She nodded. "More than okay." Ethan turned to his father. "Dad?" David smirked. "I've had worse welcomes." Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "I appreciate you being here." David clapped a hand on his son's shoulder. "I wouldn't be anywhere else." From across the room, Walter and Vivian watched the exchange with unreadable expressions. It was clear they were not used to losing, but tonight they had. And the night had only just begun. The hum of conversation in the grand Montgomery dining hall carried an undercurrent of tension. The chandeliers overhead cast warm golden light over the long, elegantly adorned tables, but the air was thick with something unseen. Judgment, expectation, the unspoken battle lines drawn between two very different worlds. David Carter sat beside his son, his posture relaxed, but his mind sharp. He had been in uncomfortable rooms before, surrounded by men who thought they were better than him. This wasn't new. But tonight was different, because tonight they weren't just looking down on him. They were looking down on his son. Across the table, Walter Montgomery held court like a king among his subjects. He leaned back in his chair, his whiskey glass poised effortlessly between his fingers, his face set in a mask of casual amusement. Beside him, Vivian smiled politely at the conversation unfolding around them. The guests had settled into a rhythm, eating, drinking, exchanging carefully curated small talk, but every so often, hushed whispers drifted toward David's ears. "It's the Grimm's father? A mechanic. Good Lord. I can't imagine what he could have possibly given as a wedding present. A set of wrenches?" David didn't react. He had heard worse in his life. He had learned long ago that people like this didn't need a reason to look down on him. They just needed an opportunity, and tonight they were grasping at every single one. Ethan, seated beside him, was rigid with tension. He was trying to keep it together, trying to maintain his composure, but David knew his son well. He could see the way his jaw clenched with every muttered remark, the way his fingers gripped the stem of his wineglass just a little too tightly. And then Walter spoke. "So, David," he said, his voice light, conversational, but carrying a weight that made the entire table quiet slightly. "Tell us, how does a man like you raise a son like Ethan?" David lifted his gaze to meet Walter's, reading between the lines of the question. The way he said it, the way he emphasized, "a man like you," it wasn't curiosity. It was condescension. David smiled slightly, leaning back in his chair. "What do you mean, Walter?" Walter chuckled, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Oh, don't get me wrong, Ethan is an impressive young man. Built himself up, started a company, made something of himself." He paused, glancing around the table as if making sure he had everyone's attention before continuing. "But you, well, forgive me for saying, but your background isn't exactly conventional for producing someone of his caliber." A few guests chuckled softly, shifting in their seats, waiting to see how David would react. Ethan's grip tightened on his fork. Isabel reached under the table, placing a calming hand on his knee. David didn't blink. "And what background would that be, Walter?" Walter shrugged, feigning innocence. "Oh, you know, a man of humble means. A working-class man. A mechanic, I believe?" More whispers. "Hey!" Another chuckle from someone down the table. David took a sip of his water before setting the glass down gently. "That's right. I've worked with my hands my whole life. Kept food on the table, put my son through school, made sure he had every opportunity to build the future he wanted." He tilted his head slightly. "What about you, Walter? What exactly did you do for your children, besides write checks?" The table fell silent. Walter's smile twitched. "Just barely." Vivian, sensing the shift, let out a small laugh. "Oh, David, no one is questioning your hard work. We're simply acknowledging how unexpected it is. That's all." David turned his gaze to her now, his expression unreadable. "Unexpected?" he echoed. That a boy raised by a man like me could be standing here, marrying your daughter. Vivian hesitated, just for a fraction of a second before recovering. We just mean that Ethan has done quite well for himself, given his circumstances. His circumstances, David repeated. Ethan had heard enough. He set his fork down with a soft clink against his plate and straightened in his chair. Let's get something straight, he said, his voice even but carrying a quiet fury beneath it. My father didn't get lucky raising me. He didn't stumble into raising a so-called successful son. He built me. He taught me discipline, integrity. He made me the man I am, and if you think his work or his background somehow makes him less worthy to sit at this table, then maybe you're the ones who don't belong here. The weight of Ethan's words settled heavily over the table. Even the waiters moving between the guests slowed slightly, sensing the sudden shift in atmosphere. Walter let out a slow breath, his expression unreadable. But his eyes, they carried something sharp, something dangerous. Oh, Ethan, Walter said smoothly, no one is saying your father isn't a good man, but let's be realistic here. Marriage isn't just about love, it's about partnership. And partnerships are strongest when both parties bring something to the table. Ethan narrowed his eyes. And what exactly are you implying? Walter leaned forward slightly. I'm saying that Isabel is bringing a lot to this marriage. And your father, well, let's just say, I'm very curious about what exactly he brings to the table. A murmur ran through the guests. The insult was veiled, but barely. David remained silent for a long moment. And then finally, he smiled. I suppose you'll find out soon enough, he said. Walter raised an eyebrow. Oh, and why is that? David set his napkin down beside his plate. Because tomorrow I'll be giving my son and Isabel their wedding gift, and I imagine it'll answer your question better than I ever could. Silence. Walter studied him for a moment, then leaned back in his chair, his smirk returning. Well, he said, now I'm intrigued. David simply nodded. You should be. And with that, he picked up his glass of water, took a slow sip, and set it down again. Across the table, Ethan glanced at his father, his eyes searching for answers. But David simply smiled at him, the same calm, knowing smile he had worn through every battle, every hardship, every judgmental stare thrown his way. Because he knew. He knew that by tomorrow night, Walter Montgomery and everyone else in this room would never look at him the same way again. The morning sun filtered through the grand stained-glass windows of the Montgomery estate, casting colored patterns across the polished marble floor. The scent of fresh-cut roses filled the air, mingling with the expensive perfumes worn by guests arriving in clusters, their hushed voices carrying an undercurrent of anticipation. Today was the day. The wedding. Ethan stood in the groom's suite, buttoning his crisp white shirt, his fingers steady despite the tension building in his chest. He had always imagined this moment, standing at the altar, waiting for Isabel, the woman he loved, to walk down the aisle. What he hadn't imagined was the silent war being waged around them. The unspoken battle of expectations, class, and legacy that threatened to taint what was supposed to be the happiest day of their lives. Jordan, his best man, adjusted his cufflinks before glancing at Ethan through the mirror. You holding up okay? Ethan gave a tight-lipped smile. Define okay. Jordan smirked. Okay as in ready to marry the love of your life and say to hell with everyone else's opinions? Not okay as in One wrong comment from Walter Montgomery might make me put a fist through a wall." Ethan chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. "Somewhere in between." Jordan leaned against the dresser, crossing his arms. "Your dad's holding up better than you are." That made Ethan pause. "You saw him?" Jordan nodded. "Just now. He's downstairs, already blending into the background like he always does. Calm, collected, like he's got something up his sleeve." Ethan frowned slightly. "He does." Jordan's eyebrows shot up. "Oh?" Ethan exhaled. "He's got a gift for us. Something that, according to him, will answer all of Walter Montgomery's questions." Jordan let out a low whistle. "I like the sound of that." Ethan did too. But there was still so much ahead. And first, he had to make it through the ceremony. Across the estate, in a suite lined with floor-length mirrors and delicate floral arrangements, Isabel sat in front of her vanity, her lace-trimmed veil draped over her shoulders. Her mother, Vivian, hovered behind her, fussing with the edges of the fabric, as if perfecting the veil would somehow perfect the day. "You look beautiful, darling," Vivian murmured, smoothing a hand down Isabel's back. "Simply breathtaking." Isabel gave a polite smile, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She had spent the morning replaying the events of the rehearsal dinner, the sharp remarks, the veiled insults, the way her father had tried to tear Ethan's father down, as if David Carter were nothing more than a blemish on the family's pristine legacy. It had taken everything in her not to snap. But today wasn't about them. It was about her and Ethan. Vivian sighed as she met Isabel's eyes in the mirror. "You're thinking about him again, aren't you?" Isabel stiffened. "About who?" Vivian arched an eyebrow. "You know who?" Isabel turned in her chair. "If you mean Ethan, then yes. I am thinking about my fiancé on my wedding day." Vivian shook her head. "I meant his father." Isabel clenched her jaw. "Why would I be thinking about David?" Vivian gave her a knowing look. "Because he's a man who doesn't belong here, and you know it as well as I do." Isabel shot to her feet, her silk robe rustling with the movement. "You're unbelievable." Vivian sighed again, as if her daughter's passion exhausted her. "Sweetheart, I am only being realistic." "No," Isabel snapped. "You're being cruel." Vivian's expression softened, but it was a carefully crafted softness, the kind designed to manipulate. "You're upset, I understand, but you must see this from our perspective. Your father and I have built a life of prestige, of careful decisions. We cannot ignore how this marriage will reflect on our family." Isabel's hands balled into fists. "This marriage is about me and Ethan, not you, not Dad, not your precious prestige." Vivian opened her mouth to respond, but the door swung open before she could, revealing one of the wedding coordinators. "Miss Montgomery," the woman said with a polite smile. "It's time." Isabel straightened, inhaling deeply. "Good." Vivian stepped forward, touching her daughter's arm. "Darling, But Isabella shook her off. "Not now, Mother." And with that she turned, gathering the edges of her gown, and walked out the door. The wedding garden was a vision of perfection. Rows of ivory chairs stretched out beneath a canopy of twinkling fairy lights, the altar framed by cascading white orchids. The guests sat in hushed anticipation, their conversations a low hum beneath the soft music drifting from the string quartet. David Carter sat in the third row, hands folded neatly in his lap, his eyes trained on the aisle. He had never seen anything like this before, not firsthand. Weddings in his world were simpler, built on love rather than spectacle. But this wasn't just a wedding. This was an event. And still, he could feel it, the whispers, the side glances, the quiet, unspoken judgment from the people around him. He ignored it. Ethan stood at the altar, his breath steady but his heart racing. Then the music changed, and the crowd shifted as everyone rose to their feet. And there she was. Isabel stepped onto the aisle, her gown flowing like liquid silk, the veil catching the soft breeze. Her eyes locked onto Ethan's, and everything else, the guests, the tension, the weight of expectation, disappeared. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. She was stunning. But more than that, she was his. Step by step, Isabel made her way forward, her father walking stiffly beside her. Walter Montgomery's face was unreadable, his grip on her arm just a little too tight. And then, finally, they reached the altar. Walter turned to Ethan, and for the briefest moment their eyes met. It was a silent warning, a final challenge, and Ethan met it head on. Walter cleared his throat before speaking. "Take care of her." Ethan held his gaze. "Always." And with that, Walter released his daughter's arm, stepping back into his place beside Vivian. The officiant smiled warmly, his voice carrying over the hushed crowd. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to celebrate the union of two people, bound by love, strengthened by commitment." David barely heard the words. He was watching his son, watching the way Ethan looked at Isabel, the way she looked back at him. It didn't matter what anyone in this room thought, because this was real. The ceremony continued, filled with vows spoken from the heart, soft smiles and quiet laughter. And then, finally, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Ethan, you may kiss your bride." The crowd erupted in applause as Ethan pulled Isabel into a deep kiss, sealing their promise with the weight of everything they had fought for. David clapped, his pride swelling in his chest. But Walter Montgomery? He sat still, his expression unreadable, because he knew. This wasn't over. Not yet. The grand reception hall at the Montgomery estate was a spectacle of opulence. The ceiling stretched high, adorned with chandeliers that bathed the room in a golden glow. White linen-covered tables were arranged meticulously, each centerpiece boasting an arrangement of rare orchids and roses, their petals fresh and untouched. The scent of aged wine mingled with the faint trace of expensive cologne, a reminder that this was no ordinary gathering. It was an event crafted for the elite, for those who saw themselves as untouchable. David Carter sat quietly at his designated table, a position that had been carefully assigned, far enough from the Montgomerys to be a subtle insult, but not far enough to draw too much attention. A strategic placement. He had expected nothing less. He could feel the glances, the way guests whispered behind their champagne glasses, their eyes flickering toward him before turning away, as if acknowledging him for too long might taint them. Ethan sat beside him, his posture stiff, his fingers drumming lightly against the table. Isabel was a few seats away, engaged in polite conversation with an older couple who clearly came from the same echelon as her parents. But even from where she sat, she kept glancing toward Ethan, toward David, her eyes filled with an unspoken apology. David offered a small smile whenever their gazes met, a silent reassurance. He was fine. He had been through worse. But Ethan wasn't buying it. "They're acting like you don't even belong in the same room," Ethan muttered under his breath, his voice laced with quiet fury. David took a sip of water before responding, his tone calm, "Because in their world, I don't." Ethan clenched his jaw. "That's bullshit." David exhaled slowly, glancing around the room. It's reality, and reality doesn't change overnight. Ethan shook his head. I don't care how long it takes. I'm not letting them treat you like this. David gave him a knowing look. And what would you have me do? Call them out in the middle of their perfect little gathering? Give them exactly what they want? Ethan didn't respond right away. He knew his father was right. Walter, Vivian, their friends, they wanted a reaction. They wanted to prove that David Carter was out of his depth, that he didn't belong, and David Carter wasn't about to give them that satisfaction. Across the room, Walter Montgomery stood from his chair, lifting his champagne glass with practiced ease. The murmur of conversation died down as the guests turned their attention to him. Ladies and gentlemen, Walter began, his voice smooth and commanding, what a night this has been. A celebration of love, of family, of two worlds coming together. David noted the slight emphasis on those last words. Two worlds, as if Ethan and Isabel's marriage was an act of diplomacy between foreign nations. Walter smiled, his eyes scanning the room. I must say, watching my daughter walk down that aisle today was a moment I will cherish forever. She looked radiant, didn't she? A polite chorus of agreement rippled through the guests. And Ethan, Walter continued, his gaze finally settling on his new son-in-law. A fine young man, hard-working, ambitious, determined. David recognized the tone immediately. It was the kind of praise that wasn't really praise at all. It was carefully crafted, designed to sound like a compliment, while subtly reminding everyone in the room that Ethan was an outsider, that he wasn't one of them. Walter raised his glass slightly. Marriage, as we all know, is a partnership, and partnerships are about balance, about what each side brings to the table. David could feel it coming. He saw the slight smirk playing at the corner of Walter's mouth, the way some guests leaned in just a little closer, sensing the shift in the air. And speaking of that, Walter said, turning his attention toward David now, I think it's only fair that we acknowledge another important figure tonight, the father of the groom. A hush fell over the room. David remained still, his face unreadable. Walter gestured toward him. Mr. Carter, would you care to stand? Ethan tensed beside him. But David was already rising to his feet, his expression calm as he met Walter's gaze. Walter smiled. Now, David, I must admit, I don't know much about your line of work, but I imagine it must be quite fulfilling. A few chuckles spread through the guests, low and knowing. David tilted his head slightly. It is. Walter took a sip of his champagne. Tell me, what exactly do you do again? I believe I heard you're in mechanics? Another round of quiet laughter. Ethan's fingers curled into fists. David, however, remained unbothered. That's right, he said simply. I own a small auto repair shop. Walter nodded, his smirk deepening. Ah, of course. Honest work. And I respect that, I do. But I must ask. He let the words linger, drawing out the tension. What exactly does a mechanic give as a wedding gift? The laughter was louder this time. Ethan shot up from his chair, his patience finally snapping. You son of a... But David raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. The room fell into silence. And then David smiled. A good question, he said, and one I'd be happy to answer. He reached into the inside pocket of his suit, pulling out a small, elegantly wrapped box. Walter arched an eyebrow, intrigued despite himself. David set the box on the table in front of Ethan and Isabel. Ethan hesitated, his anger still simmering just beneath the surface. But at his father's quiet nod, he slowly unwrapped the box, his hand steady despite the tension in the air. The moment the lid was lifted, a collective gasp rippled through the room. Inside, resting on a bed of deep velvet, was an antique mechanical pocket watch, crafted with the kind of precision and artistry that was rarely seen in modern times. The gold casing gleamed under the chandelier light, the intricate engravings telling a silent story of legacy, of history. Walter's smirk vanished. A voice from the crowd broke the stunned silence. "Is that?" David nodded once. "An original from Henry Beaumont's collection." The murmurs started immediately. Henry Beaumont wasn't just any watchmaker. He was a legend. One of the most revered craftsmen of his time. His works were considered priceless. Walter's face had gone pale. This is real?" David's smile didn't waver. "It is." Ethan stared at the watch, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. "Dad, where did you get this?" David placed a gentle hand on his son's shoulder. "It's been in our family for generations. My grandfather was a friend of Henry Beaumont. He gave it to him as a token of gratitude." The weight of those words settled over the room like a storm cloud. David turned his gaze back to Walter. "You asked what a mechanic gives as a wedding gift," he said, his voice carrying across the silent hall. "The answer is legacy." Walter was speechless. For the first time that evening, he had nothing to say. And David Carter, mechanic, widower, outsider, stood tall, unshaken. Because in the end, it wasn't about money. It was about worth. And tonight, David had proven that his was greater than all the wealth in this room. A heavy silence blanketed the reception hall as all eyes remained fixed on the gleaming pocket watch resting in its velvet-lined box. The soft candlelight reflected off the intricate gold casing, illuminating the delicate engravings that spoke of a legacy far richer than the wealth surrounding them. The tension in the air was almost tangible, thick with disbelief, admiration, and, for some, quiet shame. David Carter stood motionless, his gaze unwavering as he observed the reactions unfolding before him. Across the table, Walter Montgomery's smirk had long since faded, his fingers gripping the stem of his champagne glass so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. Vivian's expression was frozen in polite shock, though her eyes betrayed the calculation racing through her mind. And around the room, guests exchanged hushed whispers, their expressions shifting from amusement to awe. Ethan, still seated beside his father, ran his fingertips lightly over the smooth gold surface of the watch. He swallowed, his throat dry. "Dad," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't even know what to say." David's smile was small, but full of meaning. "Then, don't say anything, son. Just understand what it means." Isabel leaned in, her own fingers brushing the pocket watch in quiet reverence. This isn't just a gift. It's history," she said, looking up at David. "Why didn't you ever tell Ethan about this?" David exhaled slowly, his eyes warm but steady. "Because some things aren't meant to be measured in dollars or displayed for recognition. Some things are meant to be protected until the right moment." He nodded toward Ethan and Isabel. "And this is the right moment." A ripple of murmurs swept through the guests as realization sank in. The man they had mocked, dismissed, and underestimated had just delivered a gift that carried more weight than any check, any trust fund, any material possession in this grand estate. And he had done it without fanfare, without arrogance, just quiet, unwavering dignity. Walter cleared his throat, attempting to compose himself, though his voice carried the slightest tremor. And you've kept this all these years?" he asked, his carefully measured tone unable to mask his disbelief. David met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes." Walter's jaw tightened. "You could have sold it." David raised an eyebrow. "And why would I?" Walter gestured around the lavish room, as if the answer was obvious. "You could have built something bigger, bought yourself a business empire, secured a future beyond fixing cars." David chuckled, the sound low and knowing. "I secured a future, Walter, not through wealth, but through the choices I made. I didn't need to buy a legacy. I built one." He glanced at Ethan. "And I built it in my son." The weight of those words struck like a hammer. Walter Montgomery, a man used to winning, a man who had spent his life shaping narratives and controlling outcomes, found himself, for the first time in years, at a loss. The air in the hall was thick with something he was unaccustomed to. The slow but undeniable realization that he had miscalculated. Badly. Vivian, sensing her husband's faltering composure, stepped in smoothly. "Well, David," she said, forcing a tight smile, "this is certainly a surprising turn of events." David turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Surprising or inconvenient?" Vivian stiffened. A few guests inhaled sharply, but David wasn't done. His voice remained calm, steady, but now laced with an edge of steel. "You've spent this entire evening making sure I knew my place. But the truth is, Vivian, Walter, you never knew mine to begin with." A murmur spread through the room like wildfire. Some guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others exchanged glances, filled with quiet respect for the man who had just flipped the entire evening on its head. Ethan, who had been silent up until now, slowly rose to his feet, pocket watch still in hand. He turned to face Walter directly, his voice firm but unwavering. "You've spent years trying to convince yourself that I'm not good enough for Isabel because I didn't come from your world, that my father wasn't good enough." He held up the watch, letting the light catch its golden surface. "But this proves that you never had a clue what real worth looks like." Walter clenched his jaw. "Ethan, let's not make a spectacle." "No," Ethan cut in sharply. "That's exactly what you wanted, isn't it? You wanted to put my father on display tonight. You wanted to humiliate him, to remind everyone that in your eyes, he doesn't belong here." His gaze darkened. "But the truth is, you're the one who should be ashamed." A stunned silence followed. For the first time, Walter looked small, powerless. Isabel stood then, sliding her hand into Ethan's. "I love you," she whispered, her voice full of conviction. Ethan squeezed her hand before looking back at his father. "Dad?" "Thank you." David nodded once, his expression softening. "You never have to thank me, son." Walter, grasping at the last remnants of control, let out a forced laugh, though it lacked any true amusement. "Well, this has certainly been an interesting evening." He turned to Isabel, his voice careful. "Sweetheart, I hope you understand the implications of—" "Stop." Isabel's voice was steady, but there was no mistaking the finality in it. "Just stop." Walter faltered, blinking at her. "I've spent my whole life trying to live up to your expectations," she continued, her grip on Ethan tightening. "Trying to be the perfect daughter, the perfect representation of the Montgomery name. But tonight, I finally see what's really important. She glanced at David before looking back at her father. And it's not money, it's not power, it's not legacy, not the way you define it. Walter's face darkened. You don't know what you're saying. Yes, I do, she said, her voice unwavering. For the first time, I do. Vivian reached for her daughter's hand. Isabel, darling. No, Mother, Isabel said, stepping back. I love you both, but I refuse to let you define my future anymore. The words echoed through the hall like a thunderclap. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, one guest, an older gentleman seated near the back, began clapping. Then another, and another, until the entire room erupted into applause. Walter and Vivian, realizing they had lost, exchanged glances, their faces pale. David simply smiled, because tonight he hadn't just defended his own dignity. He had given his son and Isabel the strength to stand on their own. The battle was over, and David Carter had won. The sound of applause still lingered in the air, but the energy in the room had shifted. It was no longer the carefully curated atmosphere of prestige and controlled narratives that Walter Montgomery had so meticulously crafted over the years. No, this was something else. Something raw. Something real. Walter Montgomery had built his empire on power, on the illusion that he was always in control. But tonight, standing in the middle of his own reception hall, surrounded by the very people who once hung on his every word, he felt the unthinkable. Uncertainty. He had lost. His own daughter had drawn a line in the sand, and Ethan Carter had stood on the other side of it, unwavering. And worse, David Carter, the man Walter had spent the entire evening trying to diminish, had turned the entire room against him without ever raising his voice. Vivian's fingers clutched Walter's arm, her nails digging into the fabric of his tailored jacket. She was still smiling, but it was the brittle, desperate kind of smile, one that masked panic. "Walter," she murmured under her breath, "do something." But for the first time in years, Walter didn't know what to do. Ethan, standing tall with Isabel's hand in his, watched his father-in-law carefully. His heartbeat was steady now, his mind clear. The days of seeking Walter's approval were over. "I think we're done here," Ethan said, his voice firm but calm. "Isabel and I are going to enjoy the rest of our night with the people who actually support us." A murmur ran through the crowd. Guests exchanged glances, sensing the finality of it. Walter's eyes darkened, the loss sinking in like a stone in his chest. "You really think you can walk away from all of this?" His voice was low, dangerous. Ethan didn't flinch. "I don't need any of this." Walter exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You're making a mistake, son." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "I'm not your son." A flicker of something unreadable crossed Walter's face, but it was gone before anyone could place it. His expression hardened. "If you leave everything behind." Isabel tensed beside Ethan, but she didn't waver. She had made her choice long before tonight. "I don't need anything from you, Dad." Walter's nostrils flared. "You say that now, but let's see how you feel when—" "I said we're done," Isabel cut in, her voice sharp. "You don't get to control me anymore." David Carter, who had been silent through the exchange, finally stepped forward. His presence was steady, grounding. He looked at Walter, his expression unreadable, but not unkind. "You spent the whole night trying to prove that I was beneath you," David said quietly. But I think deep down, you knew the truth before this evening even started." Walter glared at him. "And what truth is that?" David smiled slightly, a knowing look in his eyes. "That power isn't about money. It never has been." He glanced at Ethan and Isabel. "You lost the only thing that ever really mattered tonight, and it wasn't your reputation." Walter's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Vivian, still clinging to the remnants of their shattered dignity, turned toward Isabel, her voice laced with desperation. "Please, sweetheart, don't do this. Think about everything we've given you. Everything we've built." Isabel's expression softened, but she didn't back down. "I know you love me, Mom. But love isn't something you hold hostage." A sharp inhale, a flicker of vulnerability in Vivian's eyes. But then, as if remembering where she was, she straightened, smoothing down the front of her gown, reclaiming her composure. "If you walk away now, Isabel, you won't be welcomed back." The words were meant to be a weapon, a final blow, but Isabel only smiled. "That's okay," she said softly. "I already have everything I need." The room fell into silence again. This time, it wasn't thick with tension. It was thick with finality. And then, without another word, Isabel turned toward Ethan. "Let's go." He nodded. They turned, hand in hand, and walked toward the grand double doors, leaving behind the glittering chandeliers, the whispered conversations, the ghosts of expectations they no longer had to live up to. David followed, his steps slow but steady. And as they crossed the threshold, stepping out into the cool night air, they didn't look back, because there was nothing left to look back for. The night air was crisp, carrying the distant hum of the city beyond the grand gates of the Montgomery estate. The moment Ethan, Isabel, and David stepped outside, it was as if the weight of the evening lifted from their shoulders. The distant murmur of voices from inside the grand reception hall faded, replaced by the gentle rustling of leaves and the soft click of Isabel's heels against the stone path. Ethan exhaled, long and slow, as if releasing years of silent battles in one breath. He turned to Isabel, his fingers tightening around hers. "Are you okay?" She nodded, but her eyes shimmered under the moonlight. "I knew tonight would be hard," she admitted. "I just didn't realize how freeing it would feel to finally let go." David, standing a few feet away, watched them with quiet pride. He had never doubted his son's strength, but tonight he had witnessed something greater. Ethan choosing to stand in his own power, to walk away from a life that had never truly welcomed him. And Isabel, brave and unwavering, had done the same. A valet approached, hesitant. "Sir, your car is ready," he said, glancing at Ethan. Ethan gave a small nod, but before they could move toward the waiting vehicle, footsteps echoed behind them. David didn't have to turn to know who it was. Walter Montgomery. The older man emerged from the shadows of the grand entrance, his face unreadable. Gone was the composed, untouchable patriarch of the Montgomery family. His carefully constructed world had cracked, and in its place stood a man grappling with the reality of his own defeat. Ethan squared his shoulders. "What do you want, Walter?" Walter hesitated, his gaze flickering between his daughter and his son-in-law. "You're really leaving?" Isabel's voice was steady. "Yeah." Walter exhaled, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair. For a fleeting moment, he looked tired, older than he had just hours ago. "You're giving up a lot." Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "No, Walter. I'm finally choosing what matters." Walter's lips pressed into a thin line. "And if you regret it?" Isabel stepped forward, her expression softer than Ethan's but just as firm. "Then we'll live with that choice. Together." A long silence stretched between them. Walter turned his attention to David then, his gaze unreadable. "You think you've won something here?" David met his stare without hesitation. "This wasn't about winning or losing, Walter. This was about truth, and now my son gets to start his life on his terms." Walter inhaled sharply, his fists clenching at his sides. For a moment it seemed as if he wanted to say something else, something cutting, something final. But then he did something unexpected. He nodded, just once. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back toward the house, his steps slower than they had ever been before. The three of them stood in silence, watching as the man disappeared into the grand home that suddenly felt so much smaller. Isabel let out a shaky breath, pressing her forehead against Ethan's shoulder. "Let's go home." Ethan kissed her temple. "Yeah, let's go." David clapped his son on the back before walking toward his car, pausing only once to look back at the towering estate behind them. It was beautiful, extravagant, the kind of place many people dreamed of belonging to. But tonight he had seen firsthand that belonging wasn't about wealth or appearances. It was about standing tall, knowing your worth, and refusing to be defined by someone else's standards. As they drove away, the lights from the estate faded into the distance. Ahead of them, a new beginning awaited. One built not on legacy, but on love. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. Your time and attention mean the world, and we're grateful to have you here. This story isn't just about a wedding. It's about resilience, self-worth, and the courage to walk away from toxic expectations. It reminds us that wealth isn't measured by money but by integrity, love, and the people who stand by us when it matters most. True strength isn't about winning power struggles. It's about knowing who you are and refusing to let anyone define your value. How about you? Where are you watching from? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss another inspiring story. We bring you tales that challenge perspectives, touch hearts, and remind us all of what truly matters in life. Thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next video.